Is it better to be poor in a rich country or poor in a poor country? That is a deceptively complicated question that I want to talk about today. And it's deceptive because when you think about it, it's like, well, an overall poor country might have less income inequality. Maybe you don't see as many rich people day to day, so your own poverty may seem not so bad. Like Slovenia, for instance, is a developing country that happens to be, according to the Gini Index, one of the most income equal countries in the world. Compare that to the United States, a developed country that ranks around 124 out of 157 countries for income inequality, meaning that our poor people live in an entire world that is built to remind them of what they're lacking. Not necessarily great for mental health. But on the other hand, in theory, a more economically developed country should have more resources to aid economically disadvantaged people in terms of universal health care, public transportation, universal basic income. And so apparently it's been assumed for some time amongst experts that a more economically developed country is better for poor people. Kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Like, remember last year when the stock market was doing really well and everything in our lives was great? Remember when that happened? Well, in recent years, research on this topic has shown that the former seems to actually be the correct one. Poor people in developing countries tend to be happier than poor people in developed countries. But why? Is it wealth inequality? Probably not, actually, considering that despite my examples of Slovenia and the United States, it doesn't necessarily hold true that wealthier nations tend to have more income inequality. I tricked you with cherry-picked data. Trust no one. But maybe it's because rich nations value wealth more. So poor people in those countries are more likely to think of their lack of wealth as a moral failing. Or, speaking of morality, maybe it's because richer countries are less likely to be religious, and the major world religions tend to be very anti-money and pro-helping poor people, like this study from 2012 suggested. Enter a recent paper published in PNAS and brought to my attention by valued patron Jean-Luc Picorgi, excellent username by the way. National religiosity eases the psychological burden of poverty. This is brought to us by an international collection of psychologists led by Jana B. Berkesel of University of Mannheim, best known for their groundbreaking steamroller research. The psychologists looked at 3 different data sets, 2 of which had about 1.5 million subjects, and the third had about 250,000 subjects across 156, 85, and 92 different countries. They controlled for things like income inequality, urban versus rural populations, and individualism versus collectivism even, which I covered in a video last year about how these national philosophies might explain our different reactions to the pandemic. They found that as national religiosity continues to decline, lower socioeconomic status will become increasingly harmful for well-being. I really wish I was better with statistics because in a study like this, it's so important. It's basically all what your data is and what models you put that data into. And those types of studies can sometimes be very subtly manipulated. And so because I'm not good at statistics, usually in this case, I would just have to take the author's word for it that these covariates they studied, like income inequality, really don't have anything to do with the results. Luckily, I do have a friend, Jamie Bernstein, who is a fellow writer at Skepchick and a statistician, who I asked to take a look at this study for me and tell me if the statistical models hold up. Jamie actually praised the researchers' transparency with their data and what models they used. She went on to say they ran the exact same analysis 3 times using 3 different data sets from different organizations, and they got the same pattern of results in all 3 analyses, which confirms that what they found does seem to be a real pattern and not something that was caused by some weird elements of the specifics of the way the surveys were conducted. So yeah, it seems like this study did present good evidence that religion is correlated with well-being amongst the poor. It's not an established cause, just a compelling correlation, meaning that maybe religious poor people feel better about themselves because of their religion, or maybe people who tend to be religious tend to be happier regardless. Or as Jamie points out, this is something I hadn't thought of, maybe it's something like displacement. Jamie says, it's possible that in lower GDP countries, the poorest members of the community have stayed in the same location for generations and have built strong ties to their community, which increase well-being. Whereas higher GDP countries may experience more displacement of populations, which leads to less community ties and has strong decreases on happiness and security for poor people in particular. So it could be any of that, or maybe it's something that many of us progressive atheists have already thought of and talked about nonstop at conferences and blog posts and in books, but have generally been ignored by the few large and influential secular organizations. I'm a certified dum-dum, so even though I have talked about this a lot, I'm going to again step back and just let a certified smart person say it. So here's Black Skeptics Los Angeles founder Sikivu Hutchinson in a Washington Post op-ed from 2014 saying, African Americans still live in disproportionately segregated neighborhoods with fewer living wage jobs, parks, accessible public transportation, and healthy grocery stores. We make up 13% of the U.S. population, but nearly 40% of its prison and homeless populations. This disparity has only deepened in the Obama age. Faith-based institutions provide resources to these poor and working class families. They also fight racial discrimination, offer a foundation for community organizing, and create access to social welfare, professional networks, and educational resources. These are essential issues, and atheists of color often find themselves allied in these missions. Hutchinson points out that white atheists tend to be affluent, and so they don't really care to educate themselves about what's happening to these other groups. And they don't consider it to be an atheist or even humanist issue to do much more than worry about things like separation of church and state or creationism in schools, rather than what Hutchinson rightfully says they should be focusing on, things like affirmative action, voting rights, affordable housing, reproductive rights, education, and job opportunities. When I first got involved in atheist and skeptic activism, there was a lot of befuddlement over why Black people, women, other marginalized groups weren't joining. But when people like Hutchinson said, hey, maybe it's because Black churches provide essential resources to a community under constant attack, and if humanist organizations can start caring about those issues and helping provide those resources, even if it actually means teaming up with progressive religious people, maybe more Black people will join the cause. When people like Hutchinson say things like that, the organizations responded by making room in their conference schedule for one diversity panel starring a woman, a Black person, and some flavor of gay person. Hi, I'm the woman. I often had to pay for my own airfare and hotel. So not great. So I do agree with the authors in part. Most major religions really do try to make people feel better for being oppressed or for being poor. Like, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. It's baked right there into their sacred texts. But it makes more sense to me personally to look more deeply at whether or not these developed countries are actually instituting large-scale secular safety nets that actively try to improve equality, whether income or otherwise. How many of these developed countries judge their success on how fulfilled the poorest citizen amongst them is, as opposed to prioritizing things like how well is the stock market doing? That might give us a more helpful hint as to what we need to do moving forward, other than just, I hope people stay religious, because Let's be honest, that's not going to happen.